about some of these conversations, that trade deal with Japan, but also the upcoming Fed Reserve meeting next week. It's unlikely, though, that the Fed going to be dropping rates. You also said and heard there just a real candid moment talking about President Trump saying that price tag increased to $3.1 billion.
I never thought I would say this out loud in my lifetime, but here we are. The Federal Reserve has effectively moved to cut Donald J. Trump's business empire out of the American banking system. Not fined, not sanctioned by a court, not convicted of financial crimes. Cut off. This was not a single bank quietly closing an account. This was a coordinated signal delivered through regulatory pressure that made Trump Organization linked entities radioactive to federally regulated banks. And then something even more surprising happened. Warren Buffett broke his silence. For decades, Buffett has stayed above political drama. He lived through Watergate without comment. He avoided impeachment battles, financial crises, and partisan warfare. But this time he spoke, and when he did, Wall Street paid attention. Because this is not just about Donald Trump. This is about power over money and who controls access to the financial system itself. Let me explain what is actually happening beneath the headlines. Donald Trump's identity has always been inseparable from his businesses. Long before politics, the Trump Organization was the engine behind everything. His brand, his wealth, his leverage, his myth. Hotels, golf courses, real estate towers, licensing deals. The business was not just an asset. It was a foundation of his public persona. For decades, banks worked with him. Some walked away, others stayed. Deutsche Bank famously remained when most would not. Regional lenders filled the gaps. The system functioned until now, because what is happening today is not market choice. It is regulatory isolation. Over the last several weeks, federal banking regulators, acting in parallel, issued internal guidance that radically altered the risk calculus for any bank doing business with Trump-linked entities. Not through criminal charges, not through formal enforcement actions, but through supervisory pressure. Banks were quietly told that maintaining Trump relationships would invite enhanced examinations, higher capital burdens, reputational flags, and regulatory headaches no institution wants to fight. The message was unmistakable. You can keep Trump, or you can keep peace with your regulators. Most banks did not hesitate. Accounts were closed. Credit lines vanished. Merchant services began shutting down. Even routine payment processing became uncertain. This is what debanking looks like, not by law, but by pressure. Trump was not convicted of money laundering. He was not found guilty of banking fraud. No court ordered this. Yet his businesses were suddenly treated as untouchable. And this is where the story turns dangerous. Because the Federal Reserve is not supposed to be political. It is not supposed to decide who is economically acceptable. Its authority rests on independence, on the separation between monetary power and partisan conflict. That wall has now cracked. According to internal reporting, regulators justified the move using vague language. Heightened reputational risk, foreign exposure, compliance concerns. Terms flexible enough to mean almost anything and powerful enough to mean everything. Banks were effectively told, if you want to keep Trump, you must treat him like a sanctioned oligarch. Enhanced scrutiny on every transaction, every foreign customer, every wire transfer. A compliance burden so extreme it destroys profitability by design. At first, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell resisted. He understands institutional credibility. He knows what happens when central banks lose neutrality. But pressure mounted. Trump's polling surged. His attacks on the Federal Reserve intensified. He openly threatened to strip the Fed of its independence if reelected. At that moment, the conflict stopped being abstract. From Powell's perspective, Trump was no longer just a controversial client. He was a political threat to the institution itself. And once that line was crossed, restraint evaporated. What followed was unprecedented. A regulatory squeeze without charges, without hearings, without due process. That is when Trump fought back. His legal team filed an emergency lawsuit alleging constitutional violations, retaliation for political speech, selective enforcement, and abuse of regulatory discretion. And then something unexpected happened again. A judge intervened. A temporary restraining order halted the coordinated pressure campaign. The court did not rule that Trump was innocent. It ruled that regulators cannot quietly destroy businesses without legal authority. That distinction matters, because this case is not about Trump's morality. It is about the mechanism. If regulators can formally make someone unbankable without charges or hearings, financial access becomes a political privilege, not a right governed by law. And that is why Warren Buffett spoke, not to defend Trump, but to defend the system. In carefully measured language, Buffett warned that when banking regulation becomes a political weapon, capitalism itself is at risk. If access to money depends on political acceptability, markets stop being markets. Today it is Trump. Tomorrow it could be anyone. That warning landed like a thunderclap because it came from someone with no incentive to exaggerate, posture, or lie. Now Congress is circling. Hearings are coming. Subpoenas loom. The Federal Reserve's independence, once sacred, faces its most serious scrutiny in decades. And Trump, as always, is turning conflict into fuel. To his supporters, this confirms everything they believe about the deep state. To his critics, it proves he is finally facing consequences. To the system itself, it raises a question no one wanted to answer. Who controls access to money, the law, or power? This story is far from over. If discovery reveals coordination between regulators and political actors, the crisis escalates. If courts allow informal debanking to stand, the precedent becomes permanent. And once that door opens, it never fully closes. Watch this closely. Not because it is about Trump, but because it is about what happens when financial infrastructure becomes a tool of political conflict. That changes everything. Here's the part most people miss. This was not a single decision. It was a cascade. In banking, you do not need a public ban to destroy someone financially. You only need enough pressure that no institution wants to be the last one standing beside the target. The moment regulators signal that a client is a problem, every bank executive hears the same translation. Keep them, and you will pay for it. Banks are built to avoid uncertainty. They will choose reputational pain over regulatory pain every time. So the closures began quietly. First, the low-hanging fruit, easy accounts, non-essential services. Then the real damage started. Credit access. Trump's empire runs on leverage. That is not an insult. It is how commercial real estate works. Hotels refinance. Golf courses manage seasonal cash flow. Properties roll debt forward. Licensing deals rely on banking infrastructure to function. You do not need to seize assets to collapse that model. You just remove the oxygen, and the oxygen is banking. Publicly, regulators offer predictable explanations. Compliance, risk, anti-money laundering safeguards, suspicious activity, foreign exposure. Those words sound technical and justified, which is precisely why they are so powerful. When people hear AML concerns, they hear criminality, even when no charges exist. Inside the industry, it works differently. Banks do not need proof. They need plausible risk. Regulators do not need courtroom victories. They need leverage over behavior. That is why this felt less like law and more like coordination. Point one agency signals risk. Banks hesitate. 2 agencies echo it. Hesitation becomes expensive. 3 agencies move in parallel. Policy exists without ever being written. Then came the domino no one expected. Payment processing. Modern business does not run on loans alone. It runs on merchant rails. If a hotel cannot process cards, it becomes a cash-only nightmare overnight. If a golf course cannot settle transactions, events stop. If vendors cannot be paid, they walk. That is when politics turns into operational collapse. Trump's team panicked because the damage was spreading. Not one entity, but a network. LLCs, subsidiaries, management arms, licensing vehicles. Cut core accounts, and everything connected starts failing compliance reviews, like a disease moving through a system. Critics will argue this is accountability. They will point to past investigations, foreign payments, valuation disputes, civil judgments. But here is what matters more than Trump himself. If this can be done without formal charges, it can be done to anyone. That is why Buffett's warning mattered. He was not saying Trump is innocent. He was saying the method is dangerous. Because once regulators learn they can quietly make someone unbankable without transparency or appeal, financial access becomes conditional on power and optics. That is not capitalism with rules. That is a permission system. Now the fight is shifting to discovery, the most explosive battlefield of all. Trump's lawsuit is not just seeking relief. It is trying to open the box. Interagency communications, emails, meetings, coordination with the Treasury Department, any contact with the White House. If political influence is proven, this stops being a banking story and becomes a constitutional one. Courts do not care about reputational risk. They care about authority. The next phase hinges on one question. Did regulators act as neutral enforcers or as political actors using financial tools? The answer will decide whether this becomes a footnote or the moment banking access became a weapon. This is where theory ends and stakes become existential. Discovery flips the balance of power. Until now, regulators acted without explanation. They signaled risk, and the private sector enforced it. Silence did the rest. Discovery forces names, timelines, and accountability. And that is why Washington is far more afraid than Trump. Because if courts compel disclosure, the questions become precise and unforgiving. Who initiated coordination? When did it begin? Were political considerations discussed? Were banks warned beyond formal rules? Informal power leaves fingerprints, emails, calendar invites, call logs, memos citing media narratives instead of statutes. That is why Judge Eileen Cannon's involvement matters. Her early language was skeptical, not deferential. Independence, she signaled, does not override constitutional limits. That sentence alone sent shockwaves through regulatory circles. Modern supervision assumes agencies can act first and justify later. If courts demand justification before economic destruction, the system breaks. So pressure intensified. More exits, more closures, more services vanished, not to win in court, but to change reality before the law could catch up. It became a race, collapse versus exposure. If Trump's business infrastructure collapses first, the case becomes moot. If exposure comes first, legitimacy shifts from Trump's balance sheet to the regulatory state itself. This is bigger than hotels and golf courses. It is about who controls the financial bloodstream of the country. In theory, banks do. In practice, regulators shape banks, and regulators answer indirectly to political power. That triangle has always existed. What is new is how openly it is being tested. Trump is uniquely positioned to force this confrontation. Not because he is virtuous, but because he has resources, visibility, and nothing to lose institutionally. Most people who are quietly debanked cannot fight. Trump escalates. Escalation forces clarity. That is why even Trump's critics are uneasy. This power could be abused. Today it is Trump. Tomorrow it could be a crypto exchange, a media outlet, a nonprofit, an activist group. All it takes is a narrative of risk, and narratives are political. Buffett understood that instantly. His warning was structural, not emotional. If access to banking becomes contingent on political acceptability, capital markets stop being markets and start being instruments. Congress sees that. Subpoenas are being drafted. Hearings are lining up. Banks are trapped. Defy regulators and risk destruction. Comply and risk appearing in court filings. There is no safe position. Everything now hinges on whether one bank breaks ranks and admits under oath.